So let's talk about budgets for a second. So budgets in our business are 100% a necessary evil that we have, right? They determine what is possible, what isn't possible. You get that first budget number and automatically you know what is not going to be able to be done with those numbers. So they determine the scope, the scale of our production. When I first sign on to do a theatrical project especially, one of those first questions I ask before I agree to do the show, before I sign a contract, is I get an idea of what the actual lighting budget is for the show. This is separate than what my fee is going to be, anything like that. I'm more talking about what do I have, what is the producer providing me to be able to help make this show happen. And right away, I know, let's say somebody comes to me and says, I'm going to do a production of Rent, which is a pretty big musical. I'm going to do it in a 2,000 seat theater, and your budget's going to be $1,000. That's going to throw up some pretty big red flags in my mind right away. And I'm going to say, that's probably not going to be possible. Now, that's not the end all be all. I might be able to look at it and say, oh, well, you have a ton of equipment I can use. I don't need to bring anything in for that. In that case, it's going to be fine. But it's kind of like that little test for me to help determine what the scale, what the scope of that particular project is going to be. I personally try to be a part of that budget process as early as I can. Sometimes this doesn't actually happen, but I still 100% try. So I find that, you really need to advocate for the things that you need. So a lot of times when you're being hired well past when those budgets have been determined. But there are some times where we are part of that process from the beginning. And when that happens, it's really exciting. I find that a lot of times, scenic designers get to be part of these conversations, costume designers get to be part of these conversations, but a lot of times the lighting designers are left out of them because it's not necessarily seen as something that's going to have as much of a budget outlay. How do we allocate a budget? If we're given a number, it's often our jobs to figure out how to best allocate the funds that are given to us under those numbers. So there's a couple of common expenses that happen, no matter what kind of show you're doing, that are gonna come up when you're working on lighting a show. So equipment is the obvious one. Do I have money to rent equipment for this show? And I've dealt with plenty of companies who say there's a rental budget, just like I said, but when you actually look at the numbers and you compare that to, let's say, the length of the time, right? So you say, yeah, I've got a $10,000 budget, but I want to rent it for 3 months. That $10,000 doesn't go nearly as far as it does if it's a 2-week run or a 1-month run. When you compare all those things, you start to figure out what you can and can't do with that. So as you start to examine what those equipment needs are, you also have to remember to look at everything that you might need as part of that. Yeah, I might have enough money to get 20 moving lights. That's going to be awesome. But did I remember to calculate for my control infrastructure, for my cable, for my power distribution? So now right away, those 20 moving lights can very quickly become 10 moving lights. So most rental shops are going to try to work with you on stuff. As long as you have a budget and you're realistic about what that budget is and what your capabilities under that budget are, I find that most shops that I work with are going to be very willing to try to make it happen. This is where having those relationships with those local shops in your area comes super, super into play. Because if you've got that one passion project a year that you do that doesn't have a big budget, but you really, really want to make it special, you really want to do something special for it, that company is going to be way more willing to work with you on that project and give you a really great deal on that gear if you're also throwing them other business throughout the year. Next up, it's important to think about the expendable needs for your show. So what's an expendable? An expendable is anything that gets used once or used by the show and has a limited life to it. So these are things like lamps, gels, tie line, tape, batteries, etc., etc. Anything that you're gonna buy and then it's gonna wear out or it's gonna die or become depleted. So this stuff adds up really quickly. Gobo is $12, $13 a piece. It might be up to $15 now. It's been a while since I've bought one personally. When you have a system of 40 Gobos in your show, that's gonna take up a decent chunk of your budget. So I personally try to use stock Gobos whenever I can. Usually most theater companies that I'm working in have some kind of a stock of what they have available to people. And so I'll go through and I'll have my preferred Gobos, of course, but then I'll compare them to that stock. And unless there's something that I feel really, really, really strongly or really passionate about, I'm going to adjust my design to fit because I would rather spend that money on something else other than getting 40 of that Gobo that I might really want. Again, with certain exceptions. So hopefully in a lot of the places you're working, things like lamps and tape, those are all coming out of a separate operating budget. But I still find in some places that I work that theater companies are relying on their show budgets to do those things. So you might be told, all right, well, here's your $500 expendable budget, but out of that, we got to buy 5 new lamps. And so right there goes $100 of it. right? So I always try to advocate you're able to get expendables that are only needed for your show out of your budget, and other stuff that is being used by the company all the time comes out of a separate budget. I know that especially a lot of you work in educational institutions and schools and stuff like that, and that's a question I get a lot is how do you deal with that? My administration is not giving me money for these things, and I have to build it into a show budget. And that's unfortunately that's just kind of how it is. I would try to make a case, especially if you're an educator here and you're dealing with these kinds of administrations. I would try to make a case to them that your theater group is not the only, or your drama club is not the only group using this facility. You probably have orchestra, you have chorus, you have all of these other things happening. And so that's an operating expense that you need to work into the school or the facilities budget and not into your drama club budget. So next up is labor. So this is pretty obvious. Do you have the qualified people, qualified being the key word there, do you have the qualified people you need to make this install happen? Do you have enough hands for focus? Of course, in a lot of places, this is handled by the staff of the theater company. But if it's not, sometimes you have to set aside a portion of your budget for overhire labor. I'm always of the opinion that I'd rather spend money on people instead of things. So if I'm in a situation, kind of like the one I explained earlier, if they're not giving me enough money to realistically rent anything, but they still have that money allocated, I very often have asked, hey, can we allocate that money instead towards bringing in an assistant or bringing in an associate or even bringing in a programmer? It depends on, of course, the show. It all goes back to that idea that I would rather have people instead of things, because sure, it'd be great to have those extra 2 moving lights in my show, but if I could instead get an extra 2 eyes watching that show and helping me make decisions and helping make that show better, that's going to be a whole lot more valuable to me in the long run than just having 2 extra lights would be. Next up is shipping. So shipping can be very expensive depending on what you're talking about. If you're dealing with a local rental house, it's probably going to be a couple $100, if that. If you're talking about trucking from far away, sometimes you're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars. I do a lot of shows with really big rental scenic packages. And when you look at some of the trucking numbers on those, it's absolutely insane, right? You're talking 5 digits just to move the set from wherever you are for wherever it was to the theater. So all those things are expenses you have to keep in mind. This is again where having that relationship with local shops comes in handy, because you're able to get stuff close by. You're able to get a couple $100 instead of $1,000 for your shipment, of course. So finally, last thing to talk about when it comes to budget of money is contingency. So what is a contingency? Basically, a contingency is a portion of the budget you set aside for unforeseen expenses. So to me, it's better to have one and not use it than to not have one and need it. So on a large construction project, for example, this would be something like, well, we got into construction, we realized this wall needs to move 5 foot to the left. So they're going to take money out of that contingency budget to help make those changes happen. So in our case, that might mean, well, we ended up, once we got into tech, we needed to order 6 extra sheets of Congo blue because those lamps weren't properly benched, and now all of the ones we have holes cut through, or have holes burned through them, right? So when working with these budgets, and again, I'm going to get to budget questions in 1 second. When we're working with these budgets, for me, having a spreadsheet is your absolute best friend. So I use Excel. I mostly use Google Sheets because the sharing is so powerful. What I'm able to do with that is I'm able to create complex formulas to help me estimate and figure out where I can make cuts and where I can make changes. So the first thing that I'll get when I get numbers back from a shop is I'll plug all those numbers into a spreadsheet. Hopefully I've gotten line item pricing on that, and usually I'll request that so I see exactly what each light per week is costing. And then I come up with a spreadsheet, and I can put all that information in here and then start changing my quantities to start figuring out what I can afford to cut and where I can make changes. So in this one you see over here on your screens right now, this was for a major install project I did. You can see I had a target number here of 300,000, and then as I added and subtracted each one of these lights, I was able to get closer to that number. So obviously at the point that I took this screenshot, I was $43,000 over budget. So that obviously got worked out over time, but you get the idea.